This rule resolves years of uncertainty over where federal jurisdiction on waters and land use begins and ends. The new rule finally provides consistency among all 50 states, making the federal permitting process more predictable and more affordable by reducing federal overreach and respecting states' rights, all while balancing economic and environmental concerns. To say that we are pleased to finally have resolution on this major issue is an understatement. It is now my pleasure to introduce two men who have been influential in this important decision. Please welcome both the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Andrew Wheeler, and the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, R.D. James. Thank you, Secretary Wheeler. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Hello. Thank you, Greg, for the introduction. This is actually my third time to visit with you all at a home builders show. The last time that was about 20 years ago when I worked in the Senate. It's great to be back, great to see all the exhibits and everybody here who's building homes all across our country. Under the Trump administration, EPA has worked to provide long-term certainty and a workable regulatory environment for U.S. home builders and land developers. Today's announcement is a joint effort with our partners of the Army Corps of Engineers, and I especially want to thank my partner, R.D. James, and his whole staff, who have worked collaboratively with EPA on this important initiative. Thank you, R.D. Yes. When President Trump took office, he immediately began a process to remove and replace undue regulatory burdens that stifle American innovation and economic development. To date, under President Trump's leadership, EPA has finalized 51 deregulatory actions, saving Americans more than an estimated $6.5 billion over the last 3 years. We have an additional, thank you. We have an additional 45 actions in development projected to save billions more. In a recent report found that EPA exceeded the deregulatory goals of President Trump's 2-for-1 executive order. At EPA, we are not regulating for the sake of regulating. We are crafting effective regulations that act within the authority that Congress has provided. Today, we are fulfilling President Trump's promise to provide the clarity and certainty that builders, developers, landowners, businesses, and the American people deserve by finalizing a new definition of waters of the United States in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Thank you. After 5 decades of constant litigation and uncertainty, our new rule significantly curtails the all too familiar practice of having to hire teams of attorneys to tell people how to use their own land. Over many decades and multiple administrations, federal regulators and the courts have expanded the reach of the waters of the U.S. definition, moving from waters a commercial vessel can navigate to isolated wetlands and channels that flow only when it rains. The Obama administration's 2015 rule was the most recent in a long list of actions that expanded the federal government's reach under the Clean Water Act with its WOTUS definition. The 2015 rule faced an onslaught of litigation by states representing more than 75% of the nation's land mass and was held unlawful in the courts. This litigation created a confusing regulatory patchwork across the country of states subject to different versions of the regulations. When the Obama administration put forward their 2015 WOTUS definition, they claimed it was in the interest of water quality, but it was really about power, power in the hands of the federal government over developers and landowners. Our October 2019 repeal of the 2015 definition put an end to the Obama administration's power grab. Today, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule will establish national consistency and provide greater certainty to states and landowners. It reflects considerable stakeholder engagement, including over 620,000 comments that our two agencies received on our proposed rule, many from people here in this room. When we proposed the rule in December of 2018, I outlined 3 overarching principles that are now reflected in the final product. First, property owners should be able to understand the definition for themselves. 2, EPA and the Army have clearly defined the difference between federally protected waterways and state protected waterways. And 3, we are now providing the certainty the American public needs in a manner that will be upheld by the courts. In developing this rule, we follow the language of the Clean Water Act and the relevant Supreme Court decisions. In 2018, in congressional testimony, Valerie Wilkinson, the Vice President of the ESG Corporation, shared that her company had been seeking a federal wetlands permit for a building project in Chesapeake, Virginia for nearly 30 years. Over $4.5 million into the process, Valerie said, quote, "We still are not even close to obtaining the federal 401 Clean Water Act permit for our project." That's outrageous. The North Dakota Department of Agriculture's assessment found that under the 2015 rule, approximately 80% of waters and wetlands in that state would have fallen under federal jurisdiction. The Missouri Farm Bureau estimated that waters and wetlands within its state would be 95% under the new 2015 rule. In Iowa, that estimate rose to 97%, and in Pennsylvania, that number is a shocking 99%. This is despite the fact that these and all states have their own protections for waters within their borders, and many states regulate more broadly than the federal government. Under the 2015 rule, more landowners across the U.S. would have been forced to obtain a federal permit to exercise control over their own property. After today, my hope is that home builders and land developers across the country can refocus on building communities instead of meeting with lawyers. President Trump understood the incredible burden that regulatory uncertainty was having on our country and promised to fix it. Under his leadership, the EPA and the Army Corps have delivered on that promise. Today, RD and I are here to deliver on his promise. In 2020, we are putting WOTUS in focus with a clear vision for protecting navigable waters under the Clean Water Act. Our Navigable Waters Protection Rule protects the nation's navigable waters while rebalancing the relationship between the federal government and the states in managing land and water resources. Together with existing state and tribal regulations and local government programs, our rule provides a network of coverage for our nation's water resources in accordance with the Clean Water Act. Under President Trump's leadership, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule respects the limited powers that the executive branch has been given under the Constitution and the Clean Water Act to regulate navigable waters. Congress directed the agencies under the Clean Water Act to protect navigable waters. The Navigable Waters Protection Rule does that by covering these waters and the core tributary systems that provide perennial or intermittent flow into them. It also provides certainty and predictability that will save Americans time and money while accelerating infrastructure projects and economic development. And finally, the rule will be easier to understand and implement compared to previous versions. Our final rule identifies 4 clear categories of waters that are federally regulated. 1, territorial seas and traditional navigable waters. 2, perennial and intermittent tributaries to those waters. 3, certain lakes, ponds, and impoundments. And 4, wetlands adjacent to jurisdictional waters. These four categories protect the nation's navigable waters as Congress envisioned. The final rule also details what are not waters of the United States, which includes features that only contain water in direct response to rainfall, groundwater, many ditches, including most roadside and farm ditches, are out, farm and stock watering ponds, waste treatment systems, and prior converted cropland. We also provide stronger clarification in the preamble on the factors that define wetlands. And we provided additional clarification on traditional navigable waters. What makes the navigable waters rule so well crafted is, in part, the thoughtful comments from stakeholders like you. Now, some will say that our rule leaves thousands of miles of streams and millions of acres of wetlands unprotected. These assertions are speculative and full of inaccuracies. Despite prior reports, there are no data or tools that can accurately map or quantify the scope of waters of the United States for the agency's regulatory purposes, or for comparing the 2015 rule with our new rule. In fact, already the press today is reporting inaccuracies on the numbers of acres of wetlands. This is the case today, and it was the case when the Obama administration said in 2015 that the maps, quote, cannot be used to determine Clean Water Act jurisdiction now or ever. The Obama administration said that. We're saying that the maps that the press are using to attack this regulation are completely inaccurate. While this administration agrees with the current data and tools are insufficient, we are committed to supporting the innovations needed to map the nation's waters. The nation's builders deserve that transparency. After 50 years of environmental protection, we know that making progress requires strong cooperation and coordination between Washington, D.C. and the states. States already have a robust network of regulations that protect their state waterways. Our Navigable Waters Protection Rule, together with these state efforts and other federal programs like the Great Lakes Program and the Everglades restoration efforts, will continue to ensure America's water protections, among the best in the world, remain strong, while giving states and tribes the flexibility and certainty to manage their waters in a way that best protect their natural resources and local economies. We look forward to continuing our close cooperation with our state and tribal partners as we make progress together for a stronger future. I'd also like to briefly touch on two other issues. As you may have seen, earlier this month, the White House Council on Environmental Quality proposed major updates to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. It's been 40 years since NEPA regulations have been updated, and it was long overdue. Our goal is to get all federal environmental reviews completed within 2 years. Our NEPA proposal, the administration's NEPA proposal, is now out for public comment, and I encourage all of you to take a close look and provide your insights and your views, just like you did with us on WOTUS, to make sure that we craft the best possible NEPA regulations in order to ensure that federal permits are issued within 2 years. In June of last year, we also awarded over $64 million in new investments to 149 communities across the United States through our Brownfields Multipurpose Assessment and Cleanup Grants program. We've also prioritized opportunity zones. These are the economically distressed areas that can be designated for preferential tax treatment under the President's historic tax reform package. 108 of our grants last summer went to identified sites or targeted areas in census tracts designated as opportunity zones. To date, communities participating in the Brownfields program have been able to attract an additional $28 billion in cleanup and redevelopment fundings after receiving the Brownfields funds. This has led to over 150,000 jobs in cleanup, construction, and redevelopment. When the agency puts funds into these forgotten communities, I hope that you all take notice and consider investing in these communities as well. With the federal tax incentives for these communities, together with our funds, your investments can turn lives around in our economically distressed areas all across the country. In closing, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is a big win for states, municipalities, builders, developers, landowners, and the American public. It will make it easier to understand where the Clean Water Act applies, and as importantly, where it does not. It will also help business owners spend less money and time making decisions about whether their waters are waters of the United States, and more time running their businesses and strengthening the nation's economy. Our goal from the beginning has been to put in place a more precise definition that gives the American people the freedom and certainty to do what they do best: build, grow, and thrive. I believe this rule accomplishes all three of those things, and I want to thank the dedicated career employees at EPA and the Corps of Engineers for helping us achieve this important milestone. On behalf of President Trump and his administration, I want to thank you all for your continued engagement, and thank you for allowing me to join you today to make this important announcement. In addition to our career staff, we have a number of other staff that have been working on this as well, and I want to expressly thank my Deputy Administrator Dave Ross and his counterpart Ryan Fisher at the Army Corps of Engineers, and our staffer here at EPA, Owen McDonald, who I believe you all may know because he used to work for the home builders. So thank you, Owen, and the whole team for all the hard work you've done, and it's now my pleasure to welcome my partner in this, the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Artie James. Thank you, Artie, for all the great work and cooperation in finalizing this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. You know, it was very uncomfortable standing right over his shoulder as he was giving his address, but I promise you, I was directed to do it that way. So I apologize. I also apologize that if my talk overlaps in places with Andrew's talk. We're two entirely separate agencies, the EPA, Civil Works, or the Army Corps of Engineers. We went into this giant change in the way we're making the rule on WOTUS as individual agencies, and then almost immediately turned into a collaborative effort to get the job done. And I don't know of anywhere I had rather be today than standing on this stage with Mr. Wheeler. We signed WOTUS about 3.5 hours ago, and it's now official. And we really strived to make this ruling on what's waters of the United States and what's not waters of the United States become a reality. These rules that we've all suffered under. I've farmed for 48 years. Now, I've tried to be a home builder, but I can't hit a nail twice in the same place. But I have farmed for 48 years, and much like home builders and other businesses and industries across our nation, I have been hindered. It has cost me money and time and productivity. The sad rules that we've had to live by for WOTUS. This is going to change that. Did you notice that Mr. Wheeler said you will be able to recognize yourself whether regulation of a particular area is required or not? That's a big deal. That is a big deal. I'm trying not to bore you with all my chatter. You know, I've been the Assistant Secretary of the Army now for 2 full years. I've traveled the entire country looking at civil works projects and visiting with Corps of Engineer districts, going out with them to look at projects around the country, and visited with many, many landowners. They've all expressed frustration with the agency's application of the definition of WOTUS under the previous regulations. They believe there was inconsistency across the country in application of the definition. They believe the definition was being misapplied and extended beyond the limits of the federal government. They believe local and state regulations were providing adequate protection of their local waters. And they believe there was a lack of transparency in how we were applying the definitions. This rule solves all of those concerns. This rule solves those concerns. This rule also provides room, thank you. This rule also provides room for regional flexibility, taking into account the variations in what constitutes a typical year across the country, and ensures jurisdiction is being accurately determined in times that are not too wet and not too dry. In other words, we won't be going out there and assessing a piece of property when it's been raining for 3 months. That's not typical. We're going to wait to a period of time in the weather events that is typical and then examine that property. However, the rule more importantly ensures a nationally consistent definition that is easier to implement than previous regulatory regimes. This final rule does not require in-depth data collection and analysis or legal interpretations of terms which are not transparent to you, the public. It also ensures there's an appropriate balance of power between the federal government and the preservation of the authority of states and tribes to regulate the land within their borders. As Mr. Wheeler mentioned, our agencies ensured this was a public process. In doing so, with developing this final rule, we listened to and considered approximately 620,000 public comments, as well as comments made during various other stakeholder engagements. The public engagement, as well as our engagement with states and tribes, was essential to ensuring our rule was not only legally sound, but would also be written in a manner that makes sense to landowners, those wishing to undertake activities in WOTUS, our fellow regulators in the states and tribes, and even to our own staff. What that means is, we signed the rule, we got a new rule. Now then, there's going to be somebody trying to regulate that rule, determine what is that and what is that. Under the new rule itself, that's going to be much easier for those people that have, and that's a pretty tough job when you think about it, but it's going to be much easier on them to be able to know what to regulate and know what not to regulate. And I think it will all also be a tremendous time-saving asset for all of you and all of our country. This rule, the new rule, also ensures that the activity-based exemptions remain unaffected, so that farmers, ranchers, miners, developers, home builders can continue to proceed with their exempt activities without fear of regulation, just as Congress envisioned. In fact, the exemption related to the maintenance of those limited ditches, which are within the scope of the federal government to regulate, has been clarified in the preamble, ensuring those activities can proceed without more authorization. As I told you, I've farmed American land for 48 years, and I truly, truly believe this final rule will allow farmers to do what they do best, feed this great nation. This final rule provides these same benefits to land developers, home builders, allowing the economy to continue to thrive in an environment free from unnecessary regulation and burdens. In addition to this rule in particular, Army has been working to reduce regulatory burdens elsewhere and improving permitting efficiency for all, landowners, farmers, home builders, etc., anybody in business in this country. For example, I've directed the Corps to develop guidance on ensuring appropriate permit durations so that the issued permit time frame matches the project construction time frame. I pray and I believe that it will. This new rule on WOTUS will lead to much less confusion between our public and the people that are employed to take care of our waters of the United States in this country. Lastly, EPA and Army continue to work together. We got to the signing block on this one, but we're not finished. We're working to include streamlining the review processes, which I don't know what Mr. Wheeler would say about it, but when I arrived in D.C. in January 18, it was pathetic. It was awful how long it takes us to do something. Working on that very hard. Have talked to Mr. Wheeler about it, and we're going to continue to work that issue together. I want to thank Mr. Wheeler and his staff once again for hard work and dedication on this joint effort. I want to express my deep gratitude to the countless hours that staff has spent developing this rule to the point where Andrew and I both felt comfortable signing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Thank you for the information. And thank you for all the help.
And now joining